The East India Company, a private trading corporation, governed approximately 200 million people at its peak. It had its own army, its own navy, its own legal system, and its own currency. Its shareholders included members of the British Parliament, who voted on legislation affecting its operations. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 transformed it from a trader into a sovereign. The question it raises: whether a private corporation should be permitted to conquer and govern sovereign peoples, is the most specific pre-modern expression of a question not fully resolved in 2026. The decisive battle series begins with the battle that nobody taught you changed everything. Bengal in 1757 was the richest province in the Indian subcontinent, producing approximately 40% of India's gross domestic product, generating substantial revenues from its textile industry, and containing the most productive agricultural land in South Asia. Dhaka muslin, the specific Bangladeshi textile so fine it was called woven air, was exported across the known world. Bengal's Nawab, Siraj Dowlah, was 23 years old, recently installed, and dealing with the specific challenge of managing the East India Company's increasingly aggressive behavior within his territory. The company was fortifying its Calcutta trading post in violation of its trading license, supporting Siraj's political enemies and refusing to pay taxes. Siraj's response, capturing Calcutta in June 1756, produced the specific event sequence that led to Plassey 12 months later. The Battle of Plassey was decided before it began, through one of the most consequential acts of military treachery in history. Clive, recognizing that his approximately 3,000 company soldiers could not defeat Siraj-ud-Dowlah's army of approximately 50,000 in a straightforward engagement, made contact with Mir Jafar, the Nawab's commander-in-chief and the most powerful military figure in Bengal. The specific agreement: Mir Jafar would keep his approximately 45,000 soldiers out of the battle in exchange for being installed as Nawab of Bengal after Siraj's defeat. The agreement was recorded in a written treaty. Clive later denied signing it, an early colonial instance of documentary deniability. Mir Jafar's signature is documented. Clive's complicity is not seriously disputed by historians. The written conspiracy treaty, the specific document that committed Mir Jafar to betrayal and Clive to installing him as Nawab, was reportedly forged at one point in the negotiation. Clive's intermediary, Omachand, demanded a share of the promised Bengali treasury payment as his price for facilitating the conspiracy. Clive refused and produced two versions of the treaty, one genuine and one fraudulent, the fraudulent version containing the Omachand payment clause. When the battle was won, Clive showed Omachand the genuine document, which did not include his payment. Omachand reportedly had a mental breakdown at the revelation. Clive later told Parliament he was not bound by the fraudulent treaty because it was fraudulent, and expressed no apparent moral concern about having forged a document. The specific episode illustrates the ethical framework within which the company operated. The Battle of Plassey on June 23, 1757 lasted approximately 11 hours, most of which were not fighting. Clive's approximately 3,000 soldiers, a mix of British regular infantry and company sepoys, faced the Nawab's army near the mango grove of Plassey on the banks of the Bhagirathi River. The Nawab had approximately 50,000 soldiers and 53 French-supported artillery pieces. The battle began at approximately 8 in the morning with artillery exchanges. A monsoon rain shower in the early afternoon was critical. The Nawab's artillery ammunition became wet and unusable. The company's artillery, whose powder had been covered by tarpaulins, remained operational. The monsoon rain decided the military outcome. Mir Jafar's refusal to engage decided the strategic outcome. Siraj-ud-Dowlah, watching the battle from his war elephant, sent repeated orders to Mir Jafar to engage his 45,000 soldiers. Mir Jafar's forces remained stationary throughout the engagement. The Nawab's soldiers who did fight, approximately 5,000, were eventually overwhelmed by the company's effective artillery and infantry discipline. By approximately 5 in the afternoon, the battle was effectively decided. Siraj-ud-Dowlah fled on camel toward Patna. He was captured 2 weeks later, reportedly betrayed by another relative, and killed on July 20, 1757. He was 23 years old. Mir Jafar was installed as Nawab as agreed. Within years, Mir Jafar would himself be replaced by the company when he proved insufficiently compliant. The treachery that produced Plassey had a successor treachery built into its own logic. The financial consequence of Plassey was immediate and staggering. Clive extracted approximately £3.25 million from the Bengal treasury in 1757 values as personal profit and company revenue. He personally received approximately £234,000. In contemporary values, approximately £350 million transferred from Bengal's treasury to Britain and British individuals in direct consequence of one battle. The company gained control of Bengal's tax revenues, which it used to fund military expansion across India without drawing on British treasury resources. Bengal paid for Britain's Indian Empire, the richest province in the subcontinent, financed the colonization of the entire subcontinent. The systematic drain of wealth from India to Britain, which Plassey initiated, was quantified by Indian nationalist economist Dadabhai Naoroji in his 1876 work, The Poverty of India. Naoroji calculated that Britain was extracting wealth from India at a rate that made Indian development impossible. The analysis was later refined by economist Utsa Patnaik, whose 2017 study estimated that Britain extracted approximately $45 trillion from India between 1765 and 1938, approximately 17 times Britain's current GDP. The methodology is contested by some British economists. The fundamental argument that systematic extraction of India's revenues for British purposes contributed to India's impoverishment is supported by the specific economic data available. India was the world's largest economy at the Battle of Plassey. It was approximately 3% of global GDP at independence in 1947. Robert Clive returned to Britain extraordinarily wealthy, was elected to Parliament, and was investigated twice for corruption in his conduct in India. At his first parliamentary investigation, he delivered the specific line, "I am astonished at my own moderation," referring to the fact that he had taken only approximately £234,000 when the Bengal treasury contained far more. He was cleared of wrongdoing at both investigations. He was granted a peerage, becoming Baron Clive of Plassey. He suffered from what contemporaries described as depression and what modern clinicians might assess as post-traumatic stress or bipolar disorder. He died at his Berkeley Square home in November 1774 at the age of 49. The cause of death was recorded as overdose, possibly deliberate. The man who took India for Britain took considerable India for himself and could not survive what he had done. Clive's statue in London, positioned on King Charles Street between the Foreign Office and the Treasury, became a specific contested heritage site in the aftermath of the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement. His statue in Shrewsbury, his birthplace, was placed in storage in 2020. The debate about Clive's commemoration is the specific contemporary expression of the longer argument about how Britain accounts for its colonial history. The specific historical record, Clive's conduct was controversial even in his own time, with parliamentary investigations and contemporary critics describing his Indian activities as rapacious. The fact that Parliament cleared him twice reflects the specific institutional interests of a parliament whose members included East India Company shareholders. The debate about the statue is ultimately a debate about which version of history the country chooses to mark in public space. The Bengal that the East India Company claimed after Plassey, the modern territories of West Bengal in India and Bangladesh, is one of the most extraordinarily fertile and historically significant landscapes in South Asia. The Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta, the world's largest river delta, covering approximately 80,000 square kilometers, producing some of the most productive agricultural land on Earth. The Sundarbans, the world's largest mangrove forest, shared between India and Bangladesh, containing the Bengal tiger in its only significant remaining habitat. The specific rivers, the Padma, the Jamuna, the Meghna, the Bhagirathi, flowing through a landscape that has sustained civilization since at least the 3rd century BCE, and that produced the Dhaka muslin that the company's taxation policies would systematically destroy. The Bengal famine of 1770, which killed approximately 10 million people, approximately 1/3 of Bengal's population, occurred 13 years after Plassey, directly as a consequence of the company's tax extraction policies. The company maintained full revenue extraction during the famine rather than reducing taxes to allow food purchase. The specific mechanism, the company's revenue demands, required Bengali farmers to sell food crops to pay taxes rather than retaining them for subsistence. The famine produced the specific cognitive dissonance of a trading company that had taken control of the world's most productive agricultural delta and then watched 1/3 of its population die without reducing its tax extraction. The Bengal famine of 1770 is the most direct measurable human consequence of Plassey's financial logic, and it occurred on the company's specific watch. The Plassey debate in 2026 takes several specific forms. India and Britain are negotiating a free trade agreement whose specific terms are contested partly through the lens of colonial economic history, with Indian negotiators arguing that British trading advantages derive from a historical relationship that was not equitable. The Indian government's periodic demands for colonial-era artifacts, the Kohinoor diamond, the Amaravati sculptures, other objects removed during colonial rule, are the specific cultural dimension of the same debate. The reparations question, whether Britain owes India formal financial compensation for colonial extraction, is explicitly discussed in Indian political discourse and explicitly avoided in British political discourse. The debate is not academic. It shapes the specific terms of one of the most consequential bilateral trade relationships of the 21st century. The Decisive Battles series opening argument, established in this episode, is that the battles nobody taught you are decisive precisely because their consequences are invisible in everyday life while being structural in their effects. Nobody learns the Battle of Plassey in the way they learn the Battle of Waterloo or D-Day, but Plassey's consequences are more structurally consequential for more people. Waterloo decided which European power would dominate the 19th century. Plassey decided which civilization would absorb the wealth of the world's most populous subcontinent for 2 centuries. The battles with the most visible memorials are not always the battles with the most consequential outcomes. The series traces the battles with the most consequential outcomes, the ones whose effects are still structurally present in the world in 2026. Plassey's specific contribution to the Decisive Battles series is the foundational argument. The most decisive battles are not always the ones fought most bravely or most competently. Plassey was decided by treachery before the first shot was fired. The military engagement itself was almost incidental. What made it decisive was not the military outcome, but the financial and political architecture that followed it. The extraction of Bengal's wealth, the use of that wealth to fund further military expansion, and the specific institutional transformation of a trading company into a territorial empire. The series' opening lesson, the decision made in the tent between Clive and Mir Jafar, was more consequential than any decision made on the battlefield itself. The battles that decided the world were often decided before the fighting began. 3,000 company soldiers, 50,000 Nawab soldiers, 45,000 of whom never fought, 1 monsoon shower, 1 Bengal treasury, £3.25 million sterling in 1757 money, 10 million dead in the Bengal famine, 13 years later. The world's largest economy reduced to 3% of global GDP at independence, a statue in London, a trade negotiation in 2026, and a battle nobody taught you about. That decided the shape of the modern world more completely than almost any battle you were taught. The series continues next episode with the Battle of Adwa in 1896, the day Ethiopia defeated Italy and became the founding myth of African sovereignty, the only African nation never colonized. The battle that demonstrated to every colonized people that European armies could be defeated. The battle that produced the flag that inspired the Rastafari movement, that provided the colors of dozens of African independence flags, and that produced the specific African diplomatic tradition, still visible in the African Union's headquarters, in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia, the nation that won. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the story doesn't end here, it evolves. The battles are fought. The consequences are still running. The series has begun.